Hello, this is video 2 of my oral exam, and I'm moving into the oldest secular explanation, which is going to be the conspiracy theory. It's the oldest, at least the oldest Jewish response that the disciples stole the body, and that they just lied about the post-mortem appearances, and they lied about their newfound faith, that it was all just made up. We see this a lot today. You know, well, as far as in the scholarly, as far as scholars, not a lot of scholars hold to this, but the general public will tell you that it was just made up. The Bible was written by men, and a lot of people that don't understand that there's other sources besides those found in the Bible, and the Bible isn't just one source, but it's a collection of documentation. Um, but again, the conspiracy theory is probably the oldest known. That the oldest known hypothesis. Um, if we look through the 7 criterias for being a valid, being a good hypothesis for an historical event, the hypothesis must be true, must taken with other true statements, must imply further statements. It can it can fit this criteria that ignorance of scholarly research and laziness are major contributors to people just blindly saying it was all just made up. It that all the faith, the last 2,000 years of history, the like I said, the faith of the millions and millions of Christians throughout history. Sorry, billions. Probably about 1.5 billion. I think I said 1.5 million in the first video, it's well over 1.5 billion professing Christians across the globe, and especially throughout history, would all be based on a lie. It was just made up, and the disciples stole the body. So I guess, yeah, it can fit this hypothesis, but let's move on and let's see if it fails or which it does. Does it have great explanatory scope? Again, the burial by Joseph of Arimathea. It explains the empty tomb. It explains the post-mortem appearances. They just lied about it, and the newfound faith, that they're just lying. It was just all made up. So it does have a little bit of power. But as we go on, these are the only 2 criteria that this one's going to fit, and this is why the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead is the best hypothesis. So if we go to criteria number 3, here we have a big fail, because the conspiracy theory, unlike the resurrection narrative, it can only account for half the evidences. It doesn't make sense from a Jewish perspective, to just make up a, a suffering and a dying Messiah. That just wasn't the Jewish concept of Messiah. That it would be hard to convince people just a crazy story like this. The fact that there was embarrassment, that it was a women who boldly went to the tomb to go decorate it, that discovered the empty tomb. And instead of them themselves, they weren't the heroes. Jesus still wasn't the hero. He ascended to heaven. He didn't establish his rule and his reign, which would be a typical Jewish response of the end time, what the Messiah was expected to do, and relinquish the tyranny of their captors. So again, it would require, this hypothesis, the conspiracy theory, would need you to believe that the disciples overpowered the Roman guard, that they broke the Roman seal, that they moved the boulder, that they got rid of all the evidence, and they made up the whole story. That they, and history records them, many of the disciples and many more dying for having witnessed the resurrection. So why the embarrassment, and why wasn't there any embellishment? Again, stories like, 2 of the gospel writers recorded, some still doubted. Why would you write that down if you're trying to convince somebody and build this whole big lie up? So here the conspiracy theory fails for having great explanatory power. The third criteria, does it have great plausibility? Again, the conspiracy theory is found. This is probably well, it's found that it fails here. This is where it's probably its biggest weakness was because there was no expectation of a suffering, much less dying Messiah. Um, and the idea of a bodily resurrection, you know what, just wasn't Jewish. That just wasn't in their minds. It can't be. It just couldn't have been made up. There's better stories that would be more believable, especially in a Jewish mindset, which we'll talk a little bit more here a little bit later. And again, the plausibility, this is where it fails greatly, is there's just no evidence for it. There's no evidence that the disciples stole the body. You know what? It was recorded in the Gospels that the Pharisees bribed the Roman guards to say that they came in while they're sleeping and stole the body. And there's just no evidence for that, and probably one thing it does help out the resurrection hypothesis is that, you know, the early Jews and the early enemies against Christianity didn't deny that there was an empty tomb, which is probably the greatest evidence for the resurrection, if not the faith of the disciples, the apostles, and Christians today. The fourth criteria, the hypothesis needs to be less ad hoc or less contrived. It can't be ad hoc. And again, you have to have a whole nother set of theories that the disciples stole the body, that the Roman guards were beat up, or that they were tricked while they were asleep. And again, it assumes that the new ideas placed in the minds of the disciples that just weren't Jewish, that just wouldn't have added up to the people around them at that time. And that you'd also have to have evidence that all the apostles were just liars. They were all just mad and lunatics, and they all just made it up. And really pretty bad dudes to just make something like this up. And it also fails the fifth criteria, the general knowledge of conspiracies. You know, it wasn't embellished. The four gospel accounts and in Paul's letters, you know what, they all don't line up perfectly like a good conspiracy would. You would expect conspiracies to all you know what, say the same thing, but they don't in the gospel accounts. So here it obviously it fails the last criteria. It could, because it doesn't fit criteria 1 through 5. And so then again, the hypothesis that comes out on top is that God did in fact raise Jesus from the dead. And it's about 8 minutes, so I'm going to make my third video to answer the next